What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099, and as always, on Mondays, I talk about X-Men related things, and for the month of February, I have been talking about miniseries instead of talking about storylines in an ongoing run of X-Men comics. And so today, I want to talk about one of the post-House of M minis, part of the Decimation aftermath, if you will, Son of M. This is a 6-issue miniseries written by David Hein, who wrote Colossus Bloodline that I talked about last week. And the artist is somebody, I remember looking it up, Roy Allen Martinez. And I really love the art. The art here, it kind of looks a little bit like Frank Quietly or the late Seth Fisher. If you're familiar with either of those artists, the art here is very similar to those guys. And I really love the art because I'm a big fan of those guys. And so that's probably my favorite part of the book, but that's not to say that the writing and everything here is bad. I like some things about the writing here and the story, but the story was not as good as the art. And I want to go ahead and say, if you watched my video where I talked about Colossus Bloodlines, also written by David Hein, I did not have a single good thing to say about that story. This is a lot better than that. This actually has some character stuff that I like. It has some story stuff that I like. By and large, I think my biggest problem with this story is that it is not so much a story on its own. It exists mostly to set up the next big event. And that's something that Marvel has been doing pretty much since they started doing a big event every year, or sometimes 2 or 3 big events every year, all as far back as like Avengers Disassembled. Avengers Disassembled wasn't so much a story on its own, it led into House of M, and House of M very quickly led into Decimation, and then this is part of Decimation, and this leads into Silent War, and Silent War was a story that I think 3 people read, and then you've got all these minis and all these events, and they all always lead into something else. There's never just a story that exists by itself. It's always a stepping stone to something bigger. And because of that, I always have trouble enjoying these big events because I know that it's not a complete story. It's just part whatever in an infinite number of storylines or what have you. So that was a problem that I had with this, where I feel like a lot of the stuff that happens here, it doesn't so much come from characters making organic, natural decisions, but rather it comes from, we need to set up the Silent War story that we're going to be doing later this year or next year. I don't remember when Silent War actually happened. I read Silent War years and years ago, but I don't remember when it happened. It's happened sometime after this story, but I'm not sure exactly when. But basically, allow me to quickly talk about the plot. So, Quicksilver is one of the mutants who is depowered after the events of House of M, and he is completely despondent. He doesn't know what to do with his life, and he finally decides he's going to go to the moon where his ex-wife and his daughter live with the Inhumans. And the Inhumans are basically humans who millions of years ago were experimented on by the Kree, and they were turned into a separate species, and now they live on the moon separate from the rest of humanity. And Quicksilver goes there, and he says, okay, I want to borrow the Terrigen Mists so that I can restore my powers. And the Terrigen Mists are these crystals. When you get them wet, they give you superpowers, and the Inhumans are very protective over these crystals. They don't want anyone who's a human being to use them, and they say, no, you can't do it. Well, he does. He goes and does it anyway, and then the rest of the story is basically him. He's decided that he wants to restore the powers of every mutant. But what's weird about this is that the Terrigen crystals, they don't restore your original powers. They give you a power that is kind of similar to your original powers. Like, after he goes through the Terrigen process, he no longer has super speed. Instead, he has some kind of time travel ability. But then somehow it's making him sick, and we're never really told exactly what it's doing. But at one point, he gives his daughter some powers, and she's able to see things that she wasn't able to see before, and she sees that he's sick, that there's something inside him. I kind of took it that it was cancer, but I don't think anywhere after the story did we ever have a follow-up where we find out what ailment was going on with Quicksilver. I don't think that's ever followed up outside of this story, but basically we are told that the Terrigen process is not good for mutants. At one point Magneto goes so far as to say that it is poison to mutants, and this is all very apt to be talking about now in the post-Secret Wars Marvel Comics universe, where there's a whole lot of Inhumans versus mutants, where the Terrigen stuff is all over planet Earth, and somehow it's toxic to mutants, and I think it's being handled differently now than it was in this story, whereas I believe I I've seen some concept art or a teaser image from one of the Avengers books where Rogue has like tumors on her hand from the Terrigen stuff. So it's being handled a lot differently now than it was in this story. Whereas in this story, it wasn't all over planet Earth. You had to deliberately inhale the mists in order for it to affect you. And it didn't have any physical, like you could see any consequences of doing it. Like at one point, Quicksilver takes the Terrigen crystals to Genosha, and he gives them to Callisto, and it restores her powers, and it actually is her original powers, that's another weird thing where for some reason like Quicksilver's powers are different than what they used to be, but then like Callisto's powers are basically exactly the same, but then once it starts raining, she realizes her powers are much more intense than what they used to be, to the point where she is in agony whenever it rains or anything happens. And that's kind of the extent of the consequences of using the Terrigen crystals. There's some other characters who were introduced in Chris Claremont's Excalibur run from around this time, the series where Magneto and Professor X were trying to build a new society on Genosha. There's some of the young mutants from that series. They take the Terrigen crystals, and some of them, it kind of just slightly messes up their powers, and then some of them, it doesn't seem to have any effect on them at all. But basically, I really like the idea of Quicksilver kind of becoming this pariah that everybody in the universe hates, but he is slowly becoming his father. He basically says, you know what, I have to save mutant kind. I messed up by convincing my sister to create the House of M universe, and then that completely backfired on everybody. I need to save mutant kind. I need to restore the powers of everybody. And he refuses to see that this is a really bad idea, that his daughter, when he first does it to her, she is in pain from it, and he refuses to see that every time he meets with his future self just looks very pale, very emaciated. He refuses to see that this is a very dangerous process that he's messing with. All he can see is this is a way that he can redeem himself and also save mutant kind. And I love the idea of Quicksilver accidentally becoming like his father, because Quicksilver has never liked Magneto. Even before he found out that he was Magneto's son, he never did agree with Magneto. They were always butting heads with each other, and Quicksilver's very brief time with the Brotherhood of Mutants kind of informed his character for the rest of his time in the Marvel Universe. He was always kind of the angry, scowly one whenever he was with the Avengers, and I think part of that was he was trying to atone for his very brief time working with a team called the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. And I love the idea that whether he means to or not, he's basically becoming his father. He sees himself as this savior for mutant kind, and he's going to do whatever it takes to save mutant kind. And I also love the idea of Magneto being the voice of reason. He comes in at one point and says, what you're doing is very bad. You really shouldn't be messing with this stuff. And then Quicksilver doesn't listen to him. And then eventually the Terrigen crystals get kidnapped, or they're stolen by the U.S. government. And then they kind of leads you to believe there's going to be a big conflict between the Inhumans and planet Earth. And that's going to be covered in the Silent War miniseries. So basically, I like all the stuff with Quicksilver. I like the idea of him accidentally becoming his father, and I like the idea of him trying to fix what he did with House of M, and he ends up almost making things worse. He makes things worse for some characters. It's not quite as global as it was with House of M, but I like the idea of him trying to fix what he did, and it ends up just digging a deeper hole for himself and some others. I like all that, and I like the idea of mixing up the Inhumans in all of this. There's a character when Quicksilver is on the moon, before he's actually exposed himself to the Terrigen crystals, there's this Inhuman guy who is basically kind of a chronicler. He doesn't actually, he's part of the council. I don't remember what his exact role is. This guy, he tells Quicksilver all about the Terrigen process, and then later, whenever everyone on the moon is like, somebody's broken into the Terrigen chamber, and this guy, he looks over at Quicksilver, so he knows that it was Quicksilver. But then he waits like 2 weeks before he tells Black Bolt and the royal family what was going on. And then Black Bolt asks him, he says, they're talking telepathically, and Black Bolt says, why did you do this? Why didn't you tell me earlier? And this guy says, we have gotten fat just hanging out here on the moon, not doing anything. He says that war is what makes an Inhuman worthy of being an Inhuman, and we haven't had any war in a really long time. We need some war to make us worthy of our legacy, if you will. And I thought that was a really interesting character. Unfortunately, he's barely in the story. He's mostly just a plot device to get Quicksilver to take the Terrigen crystals away from the Inhumans. But I thought that was a very interesting character, and I wish that it would have been really cool if it had been one of the major royal family members, like Karnak or Gorgon or someone like that. But I think a lot of people would have gotten really mad if one of those guys basically betrayed Black Bolt. But I think it would have been really cool if it could have been a character that people actually cared about. But as is, I thought that was a really interesting character philosophy from this guy. Unfortunately, he's basically just a one-note character, and after he betrays the royal family by allowing Quicksilver to take the Terrigen crystals, Black Bolt exiles him to some part of the moon where he's never going to talk to anyone ever again. But by and large, I like this a whole lot more than Colossus Bloodlines, and I even like this more than a lot of the other Decimation books. Most of the other Decimation Aftermath to House of M, most of those other books were just, oh look, we've got 6 issues of mutants reacting to not having their powers anymore. And it was a whole lot of that and very little actual story. I like this because there is an actual story. Unfortunately, most of it is just setting up another big story. But overall, I did enjoy Son of M, a 6-issue miniseries, and I hope you guys liked this video. If you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will be back later in the week with some other videos. I hope you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.